Edward Griffin is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. In his book, he explains who secretly controls the money of the world and consequently who controls the world. Stay tuned for another exciting edition of Politics and Religion.
Look, there are two things I don't discuss: politics and religion.
In my house, we don't talk about politics and we don't talk about religion.
I'll talk to you about anything except politics and religion.
I never talk about politics and religion.
Politics determines how we'll live here on earth. Religion determines how we'll live forever. I'm Irvin Baxter. I think it's time we talk about it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, whatever you do, don't touch that dial. You will not want to miss today's program. We have a wonderful guest on for today, Mr. Edward Griffin. I've been acquainted with him for a long, long time, and it's a special honor today to have Mr. Edward Griffin on the program with us. He's the author of such books as The Fearful Master, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and many other works. So it's very much my pleasure today to welcome to the program Mr. Edward Griffin.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being invited.
Well, Mr. Griffin, I first became aware of you back when I was probably 25 years of age, and I'm a little older than that now, but it's been many years ago, way back, the early 70s, I think, the 1970s, and I stumbled into a bookstore, and I saw a book there. The title of it was The Fearful Master. I bought the book and one or two other books that were there that really intrigued me. I'd never been exposed to this kind of type of writing before. And when I took the book home, I could hardly lay it down. Now, what happened was, when I graduated from high school, I'll never forget, in our U.S. history book, actually it was during my junior year I was taking U.S. history, we came to the last chapter of the book, and in big bold letters, the last heading of the last chapter was The United Nations, Mankind's Last Hope for Peace. And so that was what I was taught in school. I didn't really know much about the United Nations when I was in school, didn't care much about it, to be very frank about it, but I did remember that. Well, then when I read The Fearful Master, I got an exactly opposite opinion of the United Nations, and that's when my worldview started to be turned upside down. So you have a lot to do with my worldview as I now hold it today. So I guess I have to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Sometimes when I hear that kind of a comment, I wonder whether I need to apologize or say thank you. But I know that opening one's eyes to the reality of the world can be pretty painful and very disrupting in one's life. So, but it's essential. I gather that you are like I'd rather know the truth, even though it's painful and unpleasant, than live in a dream world. So thank you for that.
Well, I guess one of the things that I really did in my life, I'm a student of Bible prophecy, and I was way back then. And I was reading in the Bible that there was a world government coming. But what I thought I understood from world politics, it seemed like that wasn't even a remote possibility at the time. Well, then when I began to read books like yours and others that I read later called, none dare call it treason, none dare call it conspiracy, and many, many other books, The Invisible Government, books of that type, all of a sudden I'm reading people who are saying that the very things that I thought I saw in the prophecies of the Bible were actually coming true. So that's the reason I suppose it had such a vast influence on my life. So anyway, thank you once again. Now, I want to dive right in here, and I do want to start with The Fearful Master first, even though I want to talk about The Creature from Jekyll Island and how critical it is for everyone to understand, even right today, the reason you wrote that particular book. But let's talk about The Fearful Master for just a moment. Now, The Fearful Master, of course, was devoted to explaining the real role of the United Nations in our world. And so I just want to ask you from the outset, is it true that the United Nations was actually formed on purpose to be a one world government?
Oh, that's not even a controversial issue. Of course it was. And everybody, I don't know who would deny that. I think the only point of denial would be that they didn't expect it to happen immediately. It was always conceived as a long-term process. They had to put the structure in place first and then gradually build upon it in a very non-threatening way, so that over a period of maybe a couple of generations, as the old folks die off and the new ones come on the scene and don't have any direct recollection of the way it used to be, gradually people get used to the idea of a world government and the loss of national sovereignty. And, you know, if the theme can be repeated often enough in the educational system and in the media, people just get used to the idea, well, yeah, it's coming, and it's a good thing, and maybe there are some problems, but it's coming. And so you get used to the idea. And so it was always designed, as I can see it, from the very beginning, it was designed to be a gradual implementation. But the fact that it was designed to be a world government, I don't think anybody could find any basis for doubting that.
So
but the thought comes to mind, if I may say now, while it's still on my mind, a moment ago you talked about this textbook that you studied, and at the very last page, I believe you said that it referred to the United Nations as our best hope, or our last best hope for peace. And of course that is the slogan, that's the mantra that many people repeat, but they don't ask the question of what is peace. You know, we're probably going to be talking about this today a lot, and that is the different definitions for words and how people use words to not only communicate ideas, but to obfuscate ideas. And in this reality, we have to be very careful. We dissect the meanings of words that are thrown at us and really understand what the person means or holds in mind when they use it. And I'm here to tell you that when they say peace, that means one thing to us and another thing to them. The thing to us, it means it's lack of war. Okay, lack of violence, lack of war, lack of death and destruction. But to the founders of this new world government, peace means something else. It means the lack of opposition, the lack of revolution, the lack of opposition to establish government. It's the peace of the graveyard. Graveyard is very peaceful. But that's not the kind of peace we have in mind. And I discovered that in my early research with the United Nations, that, you know, the idea of a world government, there's nothing wrong with that. World government in itself is neither good nor bad. The question that needs to be asked is, what kind of a world government are we talking about? If it were the kind based upon the principles that were originally embedded in the American Republic, that were originally perceived as our founding fathers, and they attempted to hardwire it into our Constitution, in which individual liberties were protected and the government was the servant of the people. If it was that kind of a government, I don't think many people would object to it if it were worldwide. But that's not the kind that's being built. The kind that's being built is built on the model of collectivism, which means that the state is all-powerful and the individuals must serve the state. So if people are not asking the right questions, and they're using words without understanding what they really mean.
I appreciate,
and therein lies the dilemma of our modern age.
Yeah, I appreciate you pointing that out, because even Adolf Hitler claimed to bring 1,000 years of peace with German supremacy, and many others fully intend to bring a peace with no war. They want to outlaw war. They want to outlaw governments having their own military. They want there to be one military under the auspices of the United Nations, and the theory being, okay, if we've only got one military, then that one military will not fight with itself, so consequently you won't have any war. The only problem, as I think you're pointing out to us today, is that if we only have one military, and what happens then when an Adolf Hitler gets control of the only army that's left, then you have the greatest tyranny that the world has ever known. And so I think that's what I hear you saying to us today.
Yeah, that's it exactly. The reason we dread war, the reason we want to obliterate war from the planet is because of death, destruction, human suffering, slavery, all of those things. That's the reason we don't like war. Well, you can have all of those things in the absence of war. If you have a worldwide totalitarian system, you can have death, destruction, slavery, all of those things, except you just won't call it war. You'll call it peacekeeping.
And
same result, though.
I believe all of us, almost everybody, would like to have no more war. There may be a few warmongers that just really enjoy war and it serves their purposes, but the average human being, we would love to live in a world without war. But we don't want to live in a padded cell. You can have perfect peace and safety in a padded cell, but who wants to live there all of our lives? One of my wake-up calls was when I saw on the back of the U.S. dollar bill the words Novus Ordo Seclorum beneath the pyramid there on the back of the dollar bill. And I took some Latin in school. I happen to know what those words meant, novus being new, ordo being order, and seclorum being secular or world. And I'll never forget when I saw that term, I thought, what in the world is this doing on the back of our dollar bill? I found out it was Franklin D. Roosevelt that put it there. So was Mr. Roosevelt already planning a new world order, a one world government, way back in 1935 when he put that on the dollar bill?
Well, of course, I don't know what was on Mr. Roosevelt's mind at the time, but I do know that he was not alone in this, as is usually the case with political movements. The leaders represent the visible part of sort of an oligarchy. It's a large group of people that cooperate with each other and share power and benefits and advantages and so forth. It's kind of a little clique. And the leader is the one that gets all the attention, but quite often the thinking and the strategy, the planning, and certainly the implementation is done by this oligarchy, by this group that surrounds or supports the leader. And when you hold that view in your mind, and look who was around Roosevelt and in the political movement at the time, and on the ideas that were being popularized in the political arena, then there's no doubt whether Roosevelt had it in mind or not, but there's no doubt that that was definitely in the mind of that oligarchy and that group that existed at that time.
So the United Nations was formed in 1945. Immediately the Cold War broke out, and so a lot of the goals of the one-worlders were thwarted for a while by this opposition between the United States and the Soviet Union. But then when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, all of a sudden we began to hear announcements from President Herbert Walker Bush at the time, and also from Mikhail Gorbachev, about this birth of the New World Order. And it was told to us that we now had to move into a process called globalization. Now, in your mind, what do they mean when they tell us, okay, we now must move into a process of globalization and we now live in a global world?
Well, that's a perfect example of what I was talking about before, where words have different meanings to different people. To the average person hearing the phrase globalization or a global world order, it sounds kind of good. Well, sure, this is a big world. We now have improved communications. We can travel faster.
I'll tell you what, Mr. Griffin, hold on right there. We're up against a break. I want you to complete your answer to that as soon as we get back. You're listening to Politics and Religion.
One day, I was listening to Politics and Religion, much like you are now, when a commercial came on about the Salvation Package. It's a set of 4 DVDs in which Irvin teaches about topics like Nicodemus' question to Jesus, "What must I do to be born again?" I remember Irvin said in the commercial, "If you don't love the truth, don't get this because it will make you mad." Well, I was hungry for the truth, so I did get it, and I am so glad I did. I'd been studying the Bible for many years, but learned there was more in the scriptures about what it means to be born again. When the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus said, "Take heed of false teaching, for many will come in my name and deceive many." Now I know what Jesus was talking about when he made that statement, and I won't be deceived. The salvation package changed my life and my eternity. I'm so thankful for that commercial I heard just a few years ago. That's why today I wanted to record one too, for someone out there listening, searching for the truth. You will find it in the salvation package. Get the 4 DVD set for $65 or the individual DVDs for $20 each.
In case you're just joining us, our very special guest today is Mr. Edward Griffin. He is the author of quite a number of books, two of them that I have personally read, The Fearful Master and The Creature from Jekyll Island. Wonderful books. Even though they've been out a while, I would still recommend that you read those books, among other things that Mr. Griffin offers. By the way, Mr. Griffin, if people want to contact you, do you have a website?
Yeah, we have several of them, actually. I suppose we start with the commercial website, where if people are interested in some of those books that you were talking about, we have those plus about 100 other books and recordings available on topics of great interest like this. And that website is called The Reality Zone. So that's realityzone.com. Okay. And then we have some others, but probably the one that will interest your readers or your listeners the most will be a site that's devoted to what we consider to be solutions to some of these problems, solutions in our time, solutions for, the immediate, for the now, and for our children and our grandchildren. And that's called Freedom Force International. And right now we're in the process of building the site. So instead of using the www, the prefix is called WP dot. So it's WP.freedomforceinternational.org. And you'll find all kinds of information there about what we would like to see happen in the immediate future. So Thanks for asking that, and I welcome anybody to read those sites and contact me there if they wish.
Okay, we appreciate it so much, and we'll give those again later on in the program. I want to get back now because we were talking concerning the term globalization. Expound a little bit more on that, if you would, please.
Yeah, I was saying that that's one of those cases where words have different meanings to the listener than perhaps they have to the speaker. And to most of us, if we hear the word globalization or a global economy or a global government, it sounds very non-threatening. It even sounds kind of nice. I mean, isn't it true that we live in a shrinking world in the sense that communications are so rapid, people can travel so quickly, commercial markets are now global, and so forth. And therefore, if you want to be up to date, you want to think globally, and you want to be a globalist, and it all sounds very good. Okay, but that's not what is meant by the people who are standing at the United Nations and giving speeches and saying, let us build a new world order or a new global order. They use those kinds of words. They have something else in mind. They are talking about a world government. They won't use that word. They sometimes will use the word governance. They'll use order and system. They don't like to use the word government because that's what it really is. And, of course, in a government, people get a clearer idea. If you use that word, they get a pretty clear idea of what's coming down the pike. Governments are designed to govern people, and people don't want to be governed. They want to be free. So that's why they avoid the word government. But that's what they mean when they use words like global and world order and so forth. They're talking about a world government. And as mentioned a moment ago, it's not just any kind of a world government. It's a very specific kind. It's one based on the model of collectivism, which means it is essentially a dictatorship. A democratic dictatorship would probably be the best way to describe it. It's based on the principles of democracy, where people supposedly have some input in their political destiny. But in truth, what really happens is that it's an oligarchy, and the people who run the show at the end of the process are not really elected, or if they are elected, it's through rigged processes whereby the candidates are selected. Like they had in the Soviet Union and many countries today. You can go to the polls and vote for the candidate of your choice, but all the candidates are selected by a small group. So you really don't have much choice. So that's the extent of the democracy in this thing. The bottom line is that they're dictatorships, and they control from the top down. That's the kind of global governance or global system that is being built today. So we have to understand the difference between how it sounds to us and what they mean when they use those words.
So if we're going to merge the United States of America into a system of global governance, I've read this many times that it's time for us to have a declaration of interdependence. But to me, that means we would have to renounce the Declaration of Independence in order to say, okay, we're no longer independent, but now we are all interdependent on this humongous, big, new one world government. Is that basically correct?
Yeah, and we're back to the same old trick again. Those words. Sure, we're all interdependent, aren't we? You know, none of us is alone. We're not an island in the world. We can't live without help of others. We're all dependent on each other to some extent, but not in terms of political entities. When they use the word Declaration of Interdependence, what they're really saying is we're going to get rid of American sovereignty. We'll no longer be an independent nation. But that wouldn't go over too well. They say, come join us. And if they said, come join us in the movement to get rid of American sovereignty, to make Americans subject to the vote at the United Nations. Come join us in this movement so that people from all around the world, leaders from all around the world, whether they be good people or corrupt dictators, makes no difference. Let's let those people pass laws that we have to live by. If they came and said that, this show would be over. So they don't. They say, let us pass a Declaration of Interdependence. And people go, oh, that sounds good.
So a couple of examples, bringing it up to modern times, to where we live right now. I know that President Obama went to the United Nations to get approval for an attack against Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and he didn't go to the U.S. Congress to get a vote there for that. And as soon as the UN passed it, the next day, NATO forces, mainly U.S. forces, were dropping bombs on Libya. Then more recently, with the agreement with Iran, again, immediately the agreement went to the United Nations. The UN voted on it overwhelmingly, and then it's kicked back into the hands of Congress. Supposedly, they will now vote on it. But of course, everybody knows if they do vote on it and everybody else has approved it, it's going to be quite a mess. And this is all kinds of pressure on the U.S. Congress. So are we really sort of seeing the United Nations becoming more and more dominant with these examples?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think we have to be aware that a lot of what you just described is more of a propaganda war. It's more for public opinion, because the people who are making these decisions right now at the White House, let's say President Obama and the administration, they're in a position today where they do whatever they want to do. They just do it, and Congress sits there completely hypnotized and does nothing to stop it. And they know that's the game that's being played. But President Obama wants to go through the appearance of having some kind of popular mandate or support. He's a little hesitant to go to Congress because he suspects that Congress will say, oh, you asked our opinion? Oh, isn't that nice? Our opinion is don't do it. He doesn't want to risk that. So he goes to the United Nations. And, you know, it doesn't make any difference what the UN says, yes or no. He's still going to do whatever he wants to do. But he's doing that as sort of a ploy for public relations purposes, to make it seem like he is not being an arbitrary dictator. So he's getting the support of this prestigious international body. But regardless of whether he got that support or not, he would have still done what he wanted to do. So we've come a long way down this path. I think the important thing is that regardless of these public relations games that they're playing, the fact is that the people in position today have no regard at all for the Constitution, the limitations that normally would be placed on their actions by the Constitution. They just ignore it completely. And those people are throughout the government now, and so there's nothing or nobody to stop them, except there's only one place that is left, and that is at the state levels. And we're beginning to see some of the states show some backbone, and they're they're standing up against the federal government, and they're saying we're just not going to do that. We're going to override you according to the 10th Amendment, and we're just not going to follow this federal law because we, the state, declares that it is unconstitutional. We declare that to be unconstitutional. That's the only point that I see today that can really throw a roadblock in this oncoming locomotive of global government.
Okay, so we're in the middle of a presidential election now. Of course, it's a little ways away yet, but the debates have already begun, and everybody's looking at all these candidates, and everybody's wondering, okay, if I vote for this man, will he do what he says, or will he say one thing and do the opposite once he's elected? Because that's been the norm over the last many years. Out of the candidates, do we have any candidates that truly still believe in the Constitution, that are opposed to one world government, and I mean with all their might? Are there any candidates like that on the horizon right now that you know of?
Well, I'm sure there are, but the question as you asked it is incomplete, I think, because let's just say that there are some candidates like Senator Rand Paul who believe in the Constitution and are definite defenders of the principles of the Constitution. But then the unspoken part of the question is, will they be strong enough to go against the political party that supports them? Or will they buckle in order just to remain in power? And I think that question with Senator Paul has not yet really been resolved. I have great hopes that if he really comes push to shove, he'll say, I'm prepared to walk away from this party if necessary in order to defend the Constitution. But the question still has to be answered. If he loses support of the party, then he may say, well, I can't be reelected without support of the party, so I'll have to compromise. But there are very few in that position. Most of those other characters really, I don't doubt if they've ever read the Constitution, or if they did read it, they don't really understand what the principles are that they're reading. So I think that the unspoken part of this issue is it's not so important about these candidates, because the mistaken impression is that if we just get the right person elected to the White House, everything will take care of itself, as though that were the thing. It's almost as though we're expecting our presidents to become kings or emperors. So that's why it's so important to have the right person as president, because once we get the right person elected, then they can do whatever they want to do. And that in itself is a terrible misunderstanding of the Constitution. The man that we want to be elected as president is the man who says, okay, I've been elected to president, now I can't do anything until Congress tells me. That's the man we want. And yet that's not the man that most people are seeking. They're saying, what will you do to save the economy? What will you do for this? What edicts will you pass? What commands will you give and make everybody follow? So we have a disconnect there. People are asking for a man on the white horse, and that is not what we need.
Well, obviously we need a person who truly believes the principles on which this nation was founded, and that is that there should be a balance between the three segments of government, and that Congress should fulfill its proper role. Now, the problem is, lurking behind the scenes in every meeting is a thing called money. The Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. We're going to spend the next half of our program talking about money and a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Where did the Federal Reserve come from? Do we need a Federal Reserve? How does it get its power? We'll be back.
In a world where our culture is traveling down a road of spiritual mediocrity, do you want to be one of the few who travel the road of spiritual maturity? Then I recommend Endtime University. This 6-semester course will guide you through understanding the Bible, keys to spiritual growth, life and teachings of Jesus Christ, and Satan defeated, sonship restored. Watch the lessons at your own pace using the structured outlines. Use the quizzes and answers to test your comprehension. Receive a completion certificate when you finish each semester, and a diploma from Endtime University once you've completed all 6 semesters. Matthew 7:13 through 14 says, "Enter in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many will go in. Because strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." Endtime University will help you walk the straight and narrow path to spiritual maturity. Call 1-800-ENDTIME and ask about Endtime University today.
Attention Livingston, McLeod, and Princeton, Texas. Irvin Baxter's coming to your area for an End-Time conference. He will be speaking on subjects such as the Great Tribulation, Sign of the Four Blood Moons, and America's God-Given Destiny. End-Time conferences are a great opportunity to meet Irvin and hear the latest events going on in Bible prophecy. Shop End-Time product and meet other people like you who are wanting to learn the prophecies of the Bible. Every time I go to an End-Time conference, I feel so energized, like one of the people that can be strong and do exploits, as Daniel 11:32 says. Go to endtime.com and under events, click the conference link or call 1-800-ENDTIME to find out more details about these conferences. We'll see you there.
I know that many of you join us at the bottom of the hour, so once again, our special guest today is Mr. Edward Griffin. He's written several books, two of which are The Fearful Master and Creature from Jekyll Island. We've spent the first half of the program talking about The Fearful Master. It is all about the United Nations and how the United Nations' ultimate goal is to become a bona fide one world government. But now in the second half of our program, we want to talk about the creature from Jekyll Island because, well, everybody likes to say, follow the money. If you want to know where the power really is, follow the money. And the first thing I want to ask you, Mr. Griffin, is the Federal Reserve was actually, the Federal Reserve Act was authored somewhere around 1910. But prior to that, what were the conditions? What was banking like before there was a Federal Reserve? Who controlled the banks? Who controlled the money? Who controlled the interest rate? Who controlled the money supply? How were things back in those days before Federal Reserve?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's a good place to begin. Most people aren't interested in pre-Federal Reserve days, but they should be. All of the bad things we're going to say in a moment about the Federal Reserve System can also be said about the banking system prior to the Federal Reserve, except for one thing. Prior to the Federal Reserve, the banking system was divided among the various states. Each state had its own little Federal Reserve System, you might say. Each state had its own central banks or its own private banks, which were given monopolistic powers by the states, given special privileges to conduct practice in a way that is not very conducive to sound business. In other words, they were given the power to create money out of nothing and issue that money as though it were really good and backed by something, and they were given the power to make loans in that money. And they used that money. They were called banknotes in those days. And so banks were given special privileges to do things that normal businesses cannot do. And as a result, because of these political privileges, the banks were extremely profitable to its owners and operators, but they created money at such an expensive rate that there were bubbles, economic bubbles, overproduction, overexpansion in all of the states. Bubbles and then collapses of bubbles. What we call them in later days, we call them booms and busts. And people would put their money into a local bank in a state. The state would then lend out all that money plus a lot more that was never put into the bank. They create it and lend it out. And then the depositors would ask for their money back. Well, they didn't have it back because it was all lent out. So there were runs of the banks. The banks had to close their doors. People lost their money. It was a terrible mess. It's pretty much the same thing that's going on now on a national level. But prior to the Federal Reserve, it was all done at a state level. So it was a mess. And it was because of government intervention and government protection and partnership with the banking system in each state. Then, because of all of that mess, we came to 1910. In that period between 1910 and 1913, the public demanded banking reform. They wanted Congress to step in and pass a law that would put an end to all of that. So Congress did step in, and it did put an end to all that, but it didn't change anything except one thing. It made it national instead of statewide. All of the problems that existed at the state level were now transferred to the federal level, and instead of putting controls and limitations on the banks, they lifted controls and limitations and gave the banks even more power to continue the Ponzi schemes that they were doing at the bank level, and they called that the Federal Reserve System. So I guess the short answer is that prior to the Fed, we had exactly the same problem, but it was limited to state geography. After the Federal Reserve System, these problems didn't go away. They were just elevated up, jacked up to the national level, and pumped up and made even larger.
Okay, now let me make sure that I don't have a misunderstanding here. Was it true that the Congress originally was given the power to mint money and to set interest rates and to determine money supply? And did that remain in the power of Congress up until the establishment of the Federal Reserve?
That's not quite true. The Congress had the power to coin money and to set the standard of what money is. And according to the Constitution, it had to be gold or silver. That was the power of Congress. They didn't have the power to set interest rates. No, who sets interest rates? That's the power of a king or an emperor setting interest rates. Who needs interest rates to be set? You know, the interest rates were to be set by the free will between borrower and lender, the forces of supply and demand in the free market. That's how interest rates were to be set. It was only after the Federal Reserve came along and the bankers convinced Congress to give them, the banks, give them the power to set interest rates and override the free market. Now that gave the banks tremendous leverage, you can imagine. But again, your answer is that, the answer to your question is that prior to the Fed, the Congress had the power to issue money, but it had to be gold and silver. And they were not allowed to issue bills of credit, they called it. That means an IOU. They were not allowed to turn IOUs into money. So Congress didn't have the power to do that, but then it created the Federal Reserve System and gave that power to the Federal Reserve System. And, you know, it would be an interesting test in the Supreme Court. How can Congress give a power to somebody that Congress itself never had? And the answer, of course, it couldn't do that, but nobody's ever had the guts to challenge that.
Okay, now, your book is titled The Creature from Jekyll Island. This goes back to what happened on Jekyll Island in 1910. There was a secret meeting there that a lot of people are unaware of. Tell us about it.
Yes, the quick summary I gave a moment ago was probably pretty startling to a lot of people, how they get away with this stuff. This is definitely a Ponzi scheme, and it's a scam. And that had to be drafted and discussed in secret and in private. And they didn't dare do that in Washington, D.C. You see, the Federal Reserve Act was actually drafted by the banks themselves. And that fact was kept from Congress and kept from the American people. In fact, it's still pretty much a secret. But back in 1910 and 1913, it was a deep secret. Nobody knew that the bankers themselves went to this private island called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was privately owned by a small group of billionaires in New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their associates. Their families all had beautiful estates there on Jekyll Island, and it's there that they went to spend the cold winter months. And they had a beautiful clubhouse there, and that's where they went and sat around for a week in private, in secret, and created the Federal Reserve Act. And then, of course, they took it back to Congress, and Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was at that meeting, put his name on it, and everybody thought that it was, you know, he wrote it, or his National Monetary Commission wrote it. He was the chairman of that group. They didn't realize that whole Federal Reserve bill was written by the banks themselves. And frankly, even today, over 100 years later, most people still don't know that.
You know, it's interesting that from what I've read, the bill was actually promoted to the American people as a bill to save the people from the big bankers, but yet the truth was the bill was written by the big bankers. It sounds like the way they do things today.
Yeah, that's exactly how they do things today. If you read those bills that come out of Congress, they all have nice sounding names to them. You know, the bill to preserve American freedom and democracy. And, that's a wonderful bill. What does it say? Oh, it takes away freedom and democracy from Americans. I see. You know, the Patriot Act. Oh, that's patriotic, right? Oh, no, very unpatriotic. Takes away freedom from Americans, you know. These bills all have these high-sounding descriptions, but when you analyze them, they usually accomplish the exact opposite of what they're saying. And if you dig deeper, you find out that the bills were written by lobbyists who represent private interests who couldn't care less about the best interest of the American people, but who have carefully written that bill so it gives them political favoritism and an advantage over their competition. It allows them to become legal plunderers of the American people. That's the system we have today.
Amschel Rothschild said, "Give me control over a nation's money and I don't care who makes her laws." Is that still true today?
Absolutely. It's just self-evident when you think about it. Now, he who pays the piper calls the tune, and that's what he was really saying. If you make the money, you can buy politicians. Politicians are not that expensive. They only cost a couple of $1 million each. And that's a real bargain if you're going to get a handle over the lawmaking power of a government. Because if you spend $5 or $10 or $20 million in lobbying activities and acquire control over a congressman or over a whole Congress, you can get your $5 or $10 or $20 million returned in terms of billions of dollars, all taken from the taxpayer. It's a good investment.
So, Mr. Griffin, is our political system as it is practiced today so corrupt that the politicians, by and large, are under the control of the banks today? Would you say that because it's so expensive to get elected, we're hearing right now reports of candidates that raised $120 million, $60 million, and so on. We're having Donald Trump stand up and say, well, I'm the one that can't be bought because I'm using my own money. Talk about this a little bit. How valid is all this?
Well, I think it's totally valid today. By totally, I guess you can give a 1 or 2 percentage margin to it. I'm sure there are exceptions, and I hope there are. Occasionally I run into some legislator who seems to be a totally honorable person, and added to that, not only totally honorable, but sufficiently independent of the political party system that he can actually do something. But that's rare. I think your statement is true. The system is very corrupt, and that's the reason we're in the mess we're in. Now, the rest of that, though, is it so corrupt that it can't be changed? Some people would say yes. I don't believe that. That's the reason I'm doing what I can. It's the reason I write books about these things. It's why I have a newsletter. It's why I go on talk shows. That's why I give lectures. I'm trying to build, not just me, there are many of us, we're trying to build a grassroots movement that I believe we still have the power and the time to turn it around. It's not going to be easy, but it's still possible.
Well, we're going to give you a chance to give your website again as soon as we get back from this break. Just so all of you will know, we're talking to Mr. Edward Griffin, author of The Fearful Master, author of Creature from Jekyll Island. And when we get back from this break, we'll give you 2 websites. If you're interested in what Mr. Griffin is doing, if you'd like to acquire these books, we'll let you know how you can do that in just a moment. I want to introduce you today to what I call the Armageddon Hospital. It was October of 2010. The headline, Israel builds world's largest underground hospital, immediately arrested my attention. When I read that it was being built in Haifa, Israel, I fully understood the implications of this announcement. Haifa is located at the western end of the plain of Megiddo, the prophesied site of the Battle of Armageddon. Would the world's largest underground hospital, specifically designed for use in time of war, actually become the hospital to which the wounded of the Battle of Armageddon would be brought? It was obvious to me that the answer to this question was undoubtedly yes.
Go to endtime.com and under Irvin's Thoughts, click the Rambam link to watch the video.
I grew up in church, and like most kids, I learned the 10 Commandments. But the 4th commandment bothered me through the years. What does it mean to keep the Sabbath? Am I supposed to keep it like they did in the Old Testament? That's why I was glad to hear Irvin come out with a new DVD, To Sabbath or Not to Sabbath. Like most Endtime videos, I was enlightened to see what had been in the Bible all along, but didn't know it was there. He laid out the scriptures in an easy-to-follow lesson, and now I don't have to worry anymore. I know how to keep the Sabbath. Get your copy today.
Grab your pencil and your paper or your notepad, whatever you use, because we're getting ready to give you 2 websites that you can, number 1, obtain the books that Mr. Griffin has written, and number 2, see other efforts that he's trying to lead to save our country and to put us back on a constitutional basis. So, Mr. Griffin, would you please give us those websites once again?
Yeah, you bet. The commercial site where we have books and recordings on these topics is called Reality Zone. And so that's www.realityzone.com. realityzone.com. And the other site where we talk about solutions and things we can actually do besides just watch it all happen is called Freedom Force International. And the preface on that is a little different. It's WP. It's WP. It actually stands for WordPress. That's the engine we're using at the moment. But it's wp.freedomforceinternational.org. So that's wp.freedomforceinternational.org. And that's where, well, I think you're going to like what you read there.
Okay, one more time. The first website where his books are available and many, many other things, realityzone.com. And then the second website where you can learn some of the things that you can do to turn the tide in our country is wp.freedomforceinternational.org. So I'm sure that Mr. Griffin would love for you to go there, and we certainly would encourage that as well. Okay, now we're talking about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has put all of us in a condition. Now, Mr. Griffin, isn't it true that there was no income tax back when the Federal Reserve was actually formed in 1913?
That's correct. Both the Federal Reserve and the federal income tax were created in the same year.
So before the Federal Reserve, could the government go in debt? Did we have deficit spending before the Federal Reserve?
Well, that's a good question. Could we? Constitutionally, the answer is no. And yet we know that they were able to do it because they sold bonds, you know. There's nothing to say that you can't sell bonds and borrow from the public in that fashion. But you can't use your bonds as money. You can't say that, okay, here's a bond for $1. and instead of a $1,000 bond, you issue bonds in $1 denominations and circulate that as money. That's something else again, you see. And so, yes, the government could have raised money and did, in fact, raise money by borrowing. But they didn't use those certificates of debt as money. That all happened when the Federal Reserve started.
So once the Federal Reserve was formed and the government started deficit spending, then is my understanding correct that the government starts borrowing from the Fed, then there's interest that must go to the Fed, And then because of the interest payments that had to be made, this led to passage of a constitutional amendment approving an income tax.
I don't see it quite that way in that sequence. I think the income tax is rather independent of the interest that the government pays to the Federal Reserve System. I think those are two standalone issues. It's possible for the government to pay interest to the Fed without having an income tax. I mean, they do have excise taxes and other kinds of taxes. But the income tax was really essential for the planners of this, what we now call the New World Order. And it was started way back then. They wanted to have some way of controlling society. The income tax, admitted even by the people who dreamed it up, the income tax was designed not so much to raise revenue as it was to redistribute revenue. It was a means of taxing some people more than others and providing benefits to those who were politically favored. It was a means of controlling and changing and engineering society, not as a means of raising revenue. It's a startling fact, but I think that's pretty well documented in my book.
But our forefathers, when they founded this nation, made an income tax unconstitutional. And they had to pass a constitutional amendment under the guise of raising money for the World War I effort under Woodrow Wilson. So it's interesting that about the same time that the Fed came into being, that we did get the income tax. Now, one more question. When the government today pays interest to the Fed, who gets the money?
Well, the money goes to the Federal Reserve System, which I don't think we mentioned it on this program, but the Federal Reserve System is a cartel. And that fact must be firmly understood. It's not a government agency. So when the banks pay money to the Federal Reserve as interest on loans, it goes to the banks who make up the cartel. But now, that's not the end of the story. According to the agreement in the Federal Reserve Act, the cartel is not allowed to keep all of that money. It's allowed to keep only as much as is necessary to pay the expenses of the cartel. I mean, that's pretty shocking when you think of it by itself. But anything left over and above the expenses of the cartel, must be returned to the federal government, which is, every year they return a large amount of money to the federal government from excess interest. This is not where the scam is. The scam is not the interest that the cartel collects on loans to the government. It's the interest they collect on loans to the private sector, to you and to me, to industry, to institutions. That's where the real action is. And that's, think about it. The banks loan money to corporations and individuals, institutions, and they just loan billions, if not trillions of dollars, and they don't have that money. They create it out of nothing, and they collect interest on nothing. That's where the action is. And most people don't look at that. They get so wrapped up looking at the interest paid to the government that they don't even see where the real action is.
What I'm driving at is, isn't it true that the Fed has stockholders that are getting profits from this interest that's pouring in, wherever it comes from?
It is true they have stockholders, but the dividends that are paid are extremely small, and they're limited, and that has virtually no motivation in this program whatsoever.
I see. Well, very interesting. Of course, ultimately, the income tax was formed. I think that happened, 1917? And we have been living under the yoke of this temporary income tax ever since. And these things are becoming an issue in the present presidential campaign. Rand Paul in particular is campaigning for an auditing of the Fed. It's never been audited since its formation 100 years ago. So his father, Ron Paul, he actually wrote a book called Audit the Fed, and there's a bill to audit the Fed in Congress, but as of right now, they've not been able to get it through. But on the other hand, there are several candidates right now that are openly advocating a abolishment of the IRS and replacing it with another form of tax. Would that be a good idea, or what do you think about that, Mr. Griffin?
Well, the two angles there is I've never been opposed to auditing the Fed because I think it needs to be independently audited. But my suspicion is that aside from finding some startling information about how much of that money is being sent overseas to foreign banks, which has already come to light, even without an audit, but I think primarily what they'll find is that the Federal Reserve is doing exactly what it's supposed to do according to the Charter. We already know what it's doing. We don't need to audit it. We know what it's doing. It's plundering the American people. I don't know why we have to audit the mafia, before we can have a law against the mafia. We don't need to audit the Fed. We need to abolish the Fed based on what we already know about it. So I think that the idea of auditing the Fed is a nice political move. It gets a lot of applause from people who don't really understand too much about it. And I support it because I think it's a step in the right direction, but I do not think it is the ultimate solution.
One last question. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but I've got to ask you this. If, in fact, the IRS were abolished, what's the best form of taxation to support our government?
I believe we should go back to the Constitution. It's all there. It's all excise taxes and that kind of thing. There should never be an income tax. I think there's too much emphasis paid on the form of the tax, whether we get it through income or whether we get it through sales tax. What we ought to be talking about is the size of the tax. If the size were limited, then it wouldn't make too much difference how we collected it. But nobody talks about that. They want to have some kind of a mechanical formula that, well, if we do this instead of that, we move A over to B and B down to C, then that's going to solve everything, and it won't. And the size of the tax is dependent upon the size of government. And that is really where we start to tackle the tax issue. We have to stop asking for the government to do everything. We have to start whittling the government back in size, because until that happens, it won't make any difference what form of tax there is. We're still going to pay the same amount in tax. So I think we're looking in the wrong direction.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's obvious that we have just barely scratched the surface of this subject. The book Creature from Jekyll Island, I've read the book through twice, and I think that's about 600 pages each time. But I found it very fascinating. I want to thank Mr. Griffin for the incredible amount of work that had to go into that book, but it's serving the American people to this very day well. So if you're interested in those books, The Fearful Master, and also in particular The Creature from Jekyll Island, you may go to realityzone.com. Very simple. Or if you want to go to his site, his action site, wp.freedomforceinternational.org. Mr. Griffin, thank you very much for taking your valuable time. We appreciate so much having you on Politics and Religion.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Okay. Well, God bless you all. We'll see you tomorrow.
Politics and Religion is a production of Endtime Ministries. It is a daily 1-hour broadcast dedicated to bringing you the prophetic fulfillments happening on a daily basis.
If you would like to listen to archive shows, subscribe to Endtime Magazine, find a prophecy conference in your area, order Endtime resources, watch our TV show, or subscribe to our free weekly e-news, call 1-800-ENDTIME or go to endtime.com and take advantage of what our site has to offer.
Connect to Endtime Ministries by partnering with us and help this message make a global impact.
Endtime Ministries is partner supported. We would like to say thank you to all of our loyal partners, listeners, and friends for helping make Politics and Religion and Endtime Ministries possible.